experience the intimate world of Troy. The last night, Helen was home, where every moment holds the weight of unspoken understanding. In this peaceful journey through time, you'll discover the quiet dignity of people living their daily lives, unaware of how their small gestures reveal the depths of human experience. Helen drew the ivory comb through her hair in long, measured strokes, each pass a meditation that had become as natural as breathing. The bronze mirror before her caught the last golden light of day, casting warm reflections across the woven tapestries that lined her chamber walls. She had chosen this room herself when Paris first brought her to Troy, drawn not to the grander quarters offered by King Priam, but to this smaller space with its window that looked out over the city's heart. The tapestries themselves told stories she had come to know by heart, scenes of Troy's founding, of gods walking among mortals, of harvests and festivals from years before her arrival. Her fingers had traced their threads during sleepless nights, learning their patterns as intimately as she knew the lines of her own palms. The weavers who had created them were long dead, but their craft lived on in every carefully placed thread, every subtle gradation of color that caught the changing light. Below in the courtyard, she could see children playing their evening games, their voices rising like incense in the still air. A little girl with dark curls reminded her suddenly of herself at that age, running through the halls of her father's palace in Sparta. But that seemed like another life now, another woman's memories. Here in Troy, she had found something she had never known she was seeking, the simple pleasure of belonging somewhere without question. The child's laughter faded as the games ended, and Helen watched the small figures scatter to their homes, each carrying the day's joy like a lamp against the gathering dusk. She remembered how foreign their games had seemed at first, how different their songs were from the ones she had learned as a child. Now she could hum their melodies without thinking, could predict which child would win their races, knew by heart the stories their mothers told them at bedtime. The olive oil lamps began to flicker as evening deepened, their flames dancing against the stone walls in patterns that seemed almost alive. She set down the comb and moved to the window, her bare feet silent on the cool marble floors. The sounds of the lower city drifted up to her, merchants calling their final sales, women drawing water from the wells, the clip-clop of donkeys carrying the day's last loads. Each sound had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. She could distinguish between the different merchants' calls, knew which wells would still have the sweetest water at this hour, could tell by the rhythm of hoofbeats whether a rider brought news of trade or war. This knowledge had accumulated without her noticing, settling into her consciousness like sediment in still water, until she realized one day that she understood Troy's rhythms as completely as any woman born within its walls. The scent of jasmine from the palace gardens mixed with the smell of bread baking in the city's ovens, creating an atmosphere so familiar it felt like part of her own breathing. She pressed her palms against the stone windowsill, still warm from the day's sun, and felt something she could not name, a contentment so complete it frightened her. The stone beneath her hands held the memory of the day's heat, releasing it slowly into the cooling air. She had learned to love these stones, worn smooth by generations of hands like hers, marked here and there by the small scars of daily life, a chip from a dropped cup, a stain from spilled wine, the gentle wearing that came from being truly lived in. In Sparta, everything had been perfect, untouchable, preserved like offerings in a temple. Here, beauty came from use, from the accumulation of ordinary moments, She had been beautiful in Sparta, they told her, but beauty there had felt like a burden, something that set her apart from other women, made her an object of desire rather than affection. Here, among the Trojan women, she had learned to braid her hair in their style, to wear their colors, to speak their dialect of the old tongue. Andromache, Hector's wife, had taught her to weave in the Trojan manner, and Cassandra had shown her which herbs grew best in the palace gardens. Those lessons had been more than instruction in domestic arts. They had been invitations into belonging. When Andromache's fingers had guided hers on the loom, showing her how to maintain the proper tension, Helen had felt something she had never experienced in all her years of being admired and desired. She had felt useful, necessary in a way that had nothing to do with her face or form. The cloth that emerged from their shared work would warm someone's child, would last beyond the memory of who had woven it. The evening breeze stirred the curtains at her window, bringing with it the sound of lyres from the great hall where the men would be gathering for their evening meal. Paris would be there, she knew, telling stories of his day's training with the younger warriors, his voice carrying that particular note of pleasure he took in being among his brothers. She would join them soon, but for now she wanted to hold on to this moment, this perfect, ordinary moment of being simply herself. She moved back to her dressing table and began to braid her hair, her fingers working automatically through the familiar pattern. The braid she chose tonight was one Cassandra had taught her, practical yet elegant, suitable for a family dinner, but elaborate enough to show respect for the occasion. Her hair had grown longer since coming to Troy, as if the very air here nourished it differently than the winds of Sparta. In the bronze mirror she caught sight of her own eyes and was surprised by what she saw there, not the haunted look she remembered from her last years in Sparta, not the desperate hope of her first months in Troy, but something steady and sure. The face looking back at her was that of a woman who knew where she belonged, who had found her place in the world not through conquest or submission, but through the slow accumulation of ordinary days lived well. In the bronze mirror, she could see not the Helen of the poet's songs, not the face that had launched 1,000 ships, but simply a woman preparing for dinner with her family. Tomorrow would bring its own concerns, but tonight there was only this: the weight of her hair in her hands, the warmth of the stones beneath her feet, and the gentle sounds of a city settling into peaceful sleep. Hector's hands moved with the practiced efficiency of years as he worked at the bronze clasps of his breastplate, each piece of armor set aside with the reverence of ritual. The courtyard was quiet now, the day's training done, the younger warriors dismissed to their own families and evening meals. He had always loved this hour, when the weight of command could be set aside along with his armor, when he could simply be a man returning home. The bronze was warm against his fingers, heated by the day's sun and the exertion of training. Each piece bore the marks of use: small dents from practice bouts, scratches from the whetstones used to maintain the edges, the subtle wearing that came from daily service. His father had worn this armor before him, and his grandfather before that, each man adding his own marks to the metal, his own memories to its weight. Andromache approached without words, her bare feet silent on the stone, her hands already reaching to help with the shoulder guards. Her fingers knew exactly where each strap lay, had learned through repetition the precise order in which his armor came off. There was something sacred in this daily ritual, this wordless dance of assistance that marked the boundary between his public and private selves. He watched her face as she worked, noting the small line of concentration that appeared between her brows when she focused on a particularly stubborn buckle. She had been helping him with his armor for 3 years now, ever since their wedding, but she still approached each piece with the same careful attention she had shown that first night. It was one of the things he loved most about her, the way she brought her full presence to even the smallest tasks, as if each moment deserved her complete attention. The leather straps had molded themselves to his body over the years, creating grooves and patterns that fit him perfectly, but would feel strange on any other man. Sometimes he wondered if he was molding himself to fit the armor just as much as it was fitting itself to him, if the weight of being Troy's defender was changing him in ways he couldn't see. But then Andromache's fingers would brush against his skin as she lifted away a piece of bronze, and he would remember who he was beneath all the metal and expectation. From the cradle in the corner came the soft sounds of their son stirring, tiny fists waving in the air as if conducting some invisible orchestra. Hector felt his heart lift at the sight. This small person who knew nothing of war or duty, who saw in his father only warmth and safety and the promise of strong arms to hold him. The child's breathing had a rhythm all its own, different from the measured cadences of military life, more like the natural patterns of wind and water. Hector had spent hours listening to that sound, especially in the early weeks after the birth, when sleep seemed impossible and wonder kept him awake. Each breath was a small miracle, a reminder that life continued its ancient work of renewal even in the shadow of walls built for war. He set the last piece of armor on its stand and turned to lift his son, marveling as always at how light the child felt in his hands that had wielded sword and spear all day. The baby's eyes, still the unfocused blue of infancy, seemed to look right through him to something beyond, and Hector found himself wondering what dreams filled such a young mind. The child's skin was impossibly soft against his calloused palms, unmarked by sun or wind, or the 1,000 small injuries that came with a warrior's life. Sometimes Hector would trace the tiny fingers with his own, amazed that something so perfect could exist in a world that seemed increasingly defined by its imperfections. These hands would someday hold weapons, would learn the weight of responsibility, but for now they grasped only at light and shadow, at the fabric of his father's tunic, at the simple joy of being held. The smell of roasted lamb and fresh bread drifted from the palace kitchens, mixing with the scent of olive oil and herbs that always seemed to cling to Andromache's hair. She moved around him as he held their son, straightening the room with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything, her presence a constant source of peace in his often turbulent days. He watched her hands as she folded the linens he had discarded, noting how she smoothed each piece before setting it aside. There was something deeply satisfying about watching her work, about seeing how she transformed the chaos of daily life into order through small, patient gestures. She never hurried, never seemed frustrated by the endless repetition of domestic tasks, as if she understood something about the nature of care that he was only beginning to glimpse. The shadows were lengthening across the stone floors, and through the open doorway he could see servants lighting the torches that would guide the family to dinner. Soon they would join the others in the great hall, and he would once again become Prince Hector, Troy's defender, the hope of his people. But for now, in this quiet moment with his wife and child, he was simply a man grateful for the weight of love in his arms. The torchlight flickered against the walls, creating patterns that seemed to dance with their own life. He had grown up in these halls, had run through these corridors as a child, but tonight they felt different somehow, not like the backdrop to his own story, but like a stage set for his son's future. What would this child see when he looked at these same stones? What stories would these walls hold for him? His son made a small sound of contentment and settled more deeply into his embrace, one tiny hand grasping at the linen of Hector's tunic. Andromache came to stand beside them, her hand resting lightly on Hector's shoulder, and for a moment the three of them formed a perfect circle of quiet happiness. From somewhere in the palace came the sound of a lyre being tuned, probably one of Paris's companions preparing for the evening's entertainment. The music seemed to float through the air like a blessing, weaving itself into the fabric of this perfect domestic moment. Hector closed his eyes and tried to memorize the feeling, the weight of his child, the warmth of his wife's touch, the sense of being exactly where he belonged in the world. When he opened his eyes again, the last light of day was fading from the courtyard, and the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own demands on his strength and courage, but tonight belonged entirely to this, to love made manifest in the weight of a child's body, in the touch of a woman's hand, in the simple miracle of being home. Chryseis's fingers moved across the loom with the certainty that comes only from decades of practice, each thread finding its destined place in the pattern she carried, not in any written design, but in the deep memory of her hands. The oil lamp beside her cast a steady golden circle of light, its flame as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, steady and warm and utterly reliable. The loom itself was older than she was, built by her husband's father from wood that had been seasoning for years before she was born. Its frame bore the marks of generations of use, smooth grooves worn by countless threads, small stains from spilled dyes, the gentle warping that came from decades of tension and release. She had learned its moods as intimately as those of a living creature, knew exactly how much pressure each joint could bear, which sounds meant the frame needed adjustment, how the wood expanded and contracted with the seasons. Behind her, she could hear her daughter-in-law moving quietly through the evening tasks, banking the cooking fire, folding the day's washing, settling the children for sleep. The soft voices of her grandchildren drifted through the small house like a lullaby, their words indistinct, but their contentment clear in every drowsy syllable. The youngest was telling herself a story, her voice rising and falling in the cadence of the tales Chryseis had told her at bedtime. Even from across the house, she could recognize the rhythm. It was the story of the princess who learned to weave moonbeams, one of Chryseis's own inventions from years of trying to make the craft seem magical to small fingers. Now those same fingers were learning to hold a shuttle, to feel the difference between wool and linen, to understand that every thread had its purpose in the larger design. She paused in her work to examine the emerging pattern, a tree heavy with fruit, its branches reaching toward borders she knew she would never complete. It was ambitious, perhaps, for a woman of her years, but something in her hands tonight seemed to know exactly what they wanted to create. Each thread seemed to choose its own path, as if the tapestry were weaving itself through her rather than being created by her. The tree was taking shape differently than she had planned, its trunk thicker than she had intended, its roots reaching deeper into the fabric than her original design had called for. But she found herself following where the pattern led, trusting the wisdom that seemed to flow through her fingers tonight. Perhaps this was what mastery truly meant, not the ability to control every thread, but the knowledge of when to let the work guide itself. The lamp guttered slightly in a draught from the window, and without looking up from her work, she reached out to adjust the wick. 40 years of weaving had taught her every sound the flame could make, every flicker that signaled the need for attention. Her fingers returned to the loom as if they had never left, picking up the rhythm that was as natural to her as breathing. The oil in the lamp was from olives her son had pressed himself, from trees that grew in the grove his grandfather had planted. There was something deeply satisfying about this continuity, about the way each generation's work supported the next. The light that illuminated her weaving tonight came from the same earth that would someday nourish her great-grandchildren, the same sun that had warmed her own grandmother's face as she worked at this same loom. Outside, she could hear the familiar sounds of evening in the Middle District, neighbors calling good nights across narrow streets, dogs settling for sleep, the distant sound of a night watchman's sandals on stone. These sounds had formed the backdrop of her life for so many years that she barely noticed them anymore. Yet tonight they seemed particularly precious, as if she were hearing them for the first time. Old Demetrius was closing his shop across the street. She could tell by the particular creak his door made when he pulled it shut. His wife would be waiting for him with warm bread and honey, just as she had every night for 30 years. The baker's apprentice was making his final rounds, calling out tomorrow's offerings in a voice that was still changing from boy to man. These rhythms had become the music of her days, as regular and comforting as her own heartbeat. The wool felt different tonight too, she realized, softer somehow, more alive beneath her touch. She had been working with wool and linen for most of her life, had taught her own daughters and now her granddaughter the secrets of the craft, but tonight the fibers seemed to sing under her fingers in a way she had never experienced before. The wool had come from sheep that grazed on the hills outside the city, sheep she had watched grow from lambs to mothers themselves. She could almost feel the sunshine and rain that had nourished the grass they ate, the hands that had sheared and cleaned and spun the fleece into thread. Each strand carried within it the story of seasons and weather, of patient shepherds and careful craftsmen, of the ancient partnership between human hands and the gifts of the earth. From the sleeping alcove came the voice of her youngest grandson, talking to himself in the half-words of dreams. She smiled without looking up from her work, remembering her own children at that age, the way they would narrate their dreams aloud as if sharing them with invisible companions. Soon he too would be old enough to learn the family trade. Her son was already a skilled weaver, and the boy showed promise with his small hands and careful attention. She could see him in her mind's eye, his dark head bent over a simple frame, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration as he learned to keep the threads even. She would teach him the songs that helped maintain rhythm, the stories that made the long hours pass quickly, the prayers that blessed each finished piece. But more than technique, she would try to pass on the deep satisfaction that came from creating something beautiful and useful, something that would outlast the hands that made it. She pulled a thread tighter, adjusting the tension with the unconscious precision of expertise. In the lamplight, the emerging tree seemed almost to move, its fruit-heavy branches swaying in a breeze that existed only in the weaving. She had woven many trees over the years, but this one felt different somehow, more alive, more present, as if it were growing rather than being created. Perhaps it was the quality of the light tonight, or the particular stillness of the air, but she felt as if she were not so much making the tapestry as discovering it, as if the pattern had always existed and she was simply revealing it thread by thread. Tomorrow she would continue the pattern, add more branches, more fruit, more life to the growing image, but tonight was complete in itself, perfect in its ordinary beauty. Deiphobus moved along the familiar stones of the great wall, his sandals making no sound on the paths worn smooth by generations of watchmen before him. The evening breeze carried the scent of salt and distant cooking fires, a mixture that had become as much a part of Troy's identity as the massive stones beneath his feet. In the distance, the Greek fires flickered like fallen stars scattered across the dark plain, their light so constant after 10 years of siege that they seemed less like enemy encampments than simply another feature of the landscape. He had grown so accustomed to their presence that he sometimes forgot they represented anything more threatening than shepherds' fires on a distant hillside. Below him, the city was settling into its evening rhythm, smoke rising from countless cooking fires, the last merchants calling out their wares before closing their stalls, mothers standing in doorways to call their children home from play. These sounds rose to him like offerings, proof of the life he and his brothers worked each day to protect. He remembered standing in this very spot as a boy, barely tall enough to see over the battlements, watching his father Priam survey the same vista. "A prince must know every stone of his city," the old king had said, his weathered hand resting on Deiphobus's shoulder. He must feel its heartbeat in his own chest. Now, 30 years later, Deiphobus understood the weight of those words, felt the pulse of Troy's life flowing through the soles of his feet as he walked these ancient stones. The torches along the wall were beginning to flicker to life, tended by the evening watch as they took over from the day guards. Each flame seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, creating pools of warm light that would guide the watchmen through the dark hours ahead. Deiphobus nodded to each guard as he passed, receiving their quiet reports of the day's observations. Nothing unusual, nothing to cause concern. He paused at the place where the wall curved toward the sea, running his fingers along a section of stone that bore the scars of a catapult strike from 3 summers past. The masons had repaired it well, but the newer stones felt different under his palm, smoother, lacking the patina of centuries that marked the original construction. This wall had been built by his great-grandfather's grandfather, each stone placed with the certainty that it would stand for 1,000 years. The sounds of the city were changing as darkness deepened, the clatter of pottery from the workshops giving way to the softer notes of evening meals being prepared. Children's voices echoed up from the narrow streets, their games growing wilder in the freedom that came with twilight. A woman was singing somewhere in the lower quarter, her voice carrying an old song about sailors returning home across wine-dark seas. At the corner tower, he paused to look out over the dark expanse of the sea, its surface barely visible in the starlight but audible in the gentle rhythm of waves against the shore far below. Somewhere out there, beyond the curve of the earth, lay the lands these Greeks had abandoned to come and lay siege to his city. He wondered sometimes what drove men to leave their homes for so long, to spend years camped on foreign shores for the sake of one woman's return. The stones of the wall still held the day's warmth, and he placed his palm against them, feeling the heat that had been gathering since sunrise slowly radiating back into the cooling air. These walls had stood for generations, had seen off other enemies, other sieges. They would stand long after this Greek army had given up and sailed home, he was certain of it. He thought of Helen, glimpsed sometimes in the palace gardens, her beauty still startling after all these years of war fought in her name. She moved through Troy like a ghost of herself, aware that every face she passed belonged to someone who had lost a son or brother or father because of her presence here. Yet, what choice had she had? Paris had taken her, and Troy had chosen to keep her. The consequences belonged to all of them now. Night birds were beginning to call from the darkness beyond the city, their voices joining the chorus of evening sounds that always accompanied the changing of the guard. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, and Deiphobus smiled at the familiar sound. Owls were sacred to Athena, and their presence was considered a good omen by the city's priests. From the great temple of Athena came the sound of evening prayers, the priests' voices rising and falling in the ancient rhythms that had marked Troy's days since before memory. His sister Cassandra would be among them, her wild prophecies temporarily stilled by the comfort of ritual. The gods listened to all prayers their father had taught them, but they answered only those that served their own mysterious purposes. From the palace behind him came the faint sound of music, probably Paris entertaining the evening gathering with songs and stories. His youngest brother had always possessed the gift of making others forget their troubles, of filling rooms with laughter even in the darkest days of the siege. It was a different kind of courage than Hector's, but courage nonetheless, the ability to keep hope alive when hope seemed foolish. The air was growing cooler now, carrying new scents from the city below. Bread baking in the late ovens, wine being poured in the taverns, the particular smell of olive oil heating over cooking fires. These were the smells of peace, of ordinary life continuing despite the presence of enemies beyond the walls. Tomorrow there would be another day of vigilance, another sunset watch, another night of quiet protection. He heard footsteps approaching along the wall, young Alexios probably, coming to take the first watch of the night. The boy had been born during the siege, had never known Troy without enemies at its gates. Yet he performed his duties with a dedication that would have made the old guard proud, understanding instinctively that the safety of everyone he loved depended on his vigilance. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear, the same constellations that had guided ships across these waters since the world was young. His grandfather had taught him their names and stories during long nights like this, pointing out the great bear and the swan, the hunter with his bright belt of stars. The stars remember everything, the old man had said. They have seen the rise and fall of cities, the birth and death of heroes. We are but a moment in their sight. Soon the formal watch would begin, and younger men would take over the walking of the walls while he joined his family for the evening meal. But for now, he was content to stand in this familiar place, watching over the city that had been his whole world since birth. The Greek fires burned in the distance, but they seemed smaller tonight, less threatening. Perhaps their owners were growing weary of this long siege, ready to sail home to wives and children they had not seen in 10 years. The night was peaceful, the city secure, the enemy fires distant and unthreatening. Tomorrow would bring another day, much like this one, another evening of quiet vigilance, another night of peaceful sleep for the people of Troy. In this moment, standing on walls that had protected his people for centuries, Deiphobus felt the deep satisfaction of duty fulfilled, of being exactly where he was meant to be. The stones beneath his feet held the warmth of the day and the strength of ages, and he was part of both, guardian of all that mattered most in the world. The young guard, Alexios, walked the familiar circuit of Troy's outer walls, his sandals finding their rhythm against the worn battlements. Tonight felt different, though he could not say why. The Greeks had sailed away 3 days ago, their black ships disappearing beyond the horizon like a fever dream finally broken. Yet something in the air itself seemed to hold its breath. His torch guttered in the night breeze, casting moving shadows that danced across the plain below. There, in the moonlight, stood the thing that had drawn his steps away from the walls and down toward the gates. The wooden horse, a gift, the elders had declared, a tribute to their victory, an acknowledgement of Troy's greatness from a defeated enemy. Alexios approached it slowly, his torch held high. The moonlight caught the grain of the wood, revealing craftsmanship that spoke of months of careful labor. Who among the Greeks had possessed such skill? The horse stood perhaps 30 feet tall, its carved mane flowing as if caught in an eternal wind, its eyes seeming to gaze toward the city walls with an expression that might have been longing or might have been something else entirely. He remembered the stories his mother had told him of the great horses that once roamed these plains before the war, before the Greeks came with their black ships and bronze spears. Wild creatures with manes like flowing water, their hoofbeats like thunder across the grasslands. This wooden beast captured something of that ancient majesty, yet there was something else in its carved features, a stillness that seemed almost to breathe. He circled the great beast, noting how the shadows fell differently with each step. The wood was pine. He could smell it even over the salt tang of the distant sea. Pine and something else. Tar, perhaps, or the oil used to preserve the timber. But there was another scent, faint and elusive, that reminded him of the stables after a long day's training, of leather and sweat and the particular musk of men who had worked hard and slept little. Drawing nearer to the horse's flank, Alexios could see the individual marks of the craftsman's tools, the smooth strokes of the adze, the careful joining of planks, the way each piece had been fitted with mathematical precision. The Greeks were known for their shipbuilding, their ability to create vessels that could carry them across vast distances. This horse showed the same mastery of wood and joint, the same understanding of how to make timber serve ambitious purposes. The night sounds of Troy drifted down from the city, a baby's cry quickly hushed, the murmur of late conversations, the bark of a dog somewhere in the lower town. All the sounds of a city at peace, a city that believed itself safe at last. Alexios had been born in the 19th year of the siege. He had never known Troy without the Greeks, camped beyond these very plains, their cook fires dotting the darkness like fallen stars. He held his torch closer to the horse's flank, studying the joinery. The work was masterful. Each plank fitted so precisely that barely a line showed where one met another. Yet here and there, if he looked closely, he could see the faintest gaps, spaces no wider than a blade of grass. Settling timber, he told himself. All wood moved as it aged, expanded and contracted with the seasons. These were merely the natural consequences of such an ambitious construction. Yet as he studied those tiny gaps, Alexios felt something stir in his chest. Not quite fear, but a kind of alertness that reminded him of hunting in the hills above the city. The same feeling that came when prey was near, when the very air seemed to whisper of hidden presence. He had learned to trust these instincts during his years on the walls, watching for Greek raiding parties in the pre-dawn darkness. But as he stood there listening, he could swear he heard something else. Not the settling of timber, but something more rhythmic, like breathing, like the slow, measured breathing of men trying very hard to remain silent. His hand moved instinctively to the hilt of his sword, then stopped. Foolishness. The horse had stood here for 3 days. If there had been men inside, they would have suffocated by now, or revealed themselves through thirst and hunger. From the city came the sound of the midnight bells from Athena's temple. Alexios thought of his wife, Penthesilea, sleeping in their small house near the lower market. She had been afraid when the Greeks first departed, certain it was some trick, but as the days passed and no attack came, even she had begun to believe that the war was truly over. Tomorrow, she had said, perhaps they could walk down to the harbor together, see the ships that would soon arrive with grain and wine and all the goods that had been denied them for so long. Standing in the shadow of the wooden horse, Alexios tried to imagine what peace would truly mean. He had spent his entire life preparing for war, learning the weight of sword and spear, the rhythm of the watch, the careful observation of distant movements that might signal attack. What would he do with himself when there were no more enemies to watch for, no more walls to guard? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. A future without the structure that had defined every day of his existence. He completed his circuit of the horse, noting how its shadow stretched long and strange across the moonlit grass. From this angle, with the moon behind it, the creature seemed almost alive, its carved muscles appearing to shift and ripple in the dancing torchlight. Its head was turned slightly toward the city, and in that carved gaze Alexios read something that made his chest tighten with an unnameable dread. Moving closer to the horse's great head, he could see the detail work that had gone into the carving of its features. The flared nostrils, the alert ears, the way the mane fell across the powerful neck. All spoke of an artist who had studied living horses with devoted attention. Yet there was something in the expression, something in the set of the carved mouth that suggested not the peaceful grazing of domestic animals, but the wild alertness of creatures preparing to run. He should return to the walls, complete his rounds. The other guards would be wondering where he had gone. Yet something held him here, some instinct deeper than thought that whispered of danger in the very stillness of this gift. The night felt different around the horse, as if the air itself were holding its breath, waiting for some signal, some moment that would change everything. As he prepared to leave, Alexios noticed something he had missed before. A small mark carved into the horse's belly, so subtle it was barely visible in the torchlight. Not a flaw in the wood, but a deliberate symbol. A ship, perhaps, or maybe just the natural pattern of the grain. But it reminded him of the marks Greek sailors carved into their vessels for luck, small signs meant to ensure safe passage across dangerous waters. Alexios turned away at last, his duty calling him back to the walls. But as he walked, he carried with him the image of those carved eyes, and the strange certainty that this was the last night Troy would sleep in peace. The wooden horse stood silent in the moonlight, keeping its secrets, waiting for dawn. In the growing darkness, the city slept on, unaware that their gift held more than gratitude. It held the seeds of their own destruction, patient and silent as the grave. Helen moved through her weaving chamber like a woman walking through her own dreams, her bare feet silent on the polished stone floor. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the room, illuminating half-finished tapestries that hung from wooden frames like captured fragments of time. She had come here tonight, drawn by restlessness, by the strange pull of unfinished work that called to her in the dark hours. Her fingers found the edge of a tapestry she had begun months ago, during the long afternoons when Paris was away with the hunting parties. The weaving had been something to occupy her hands while her mind wandered, or so she had thought. But now, in the lamplight, she saw something that made her pause. The golden threads she traced with her fingertips, when had she chosen those? She remembered selecting blues and greens, the colors of water and growing things, safe colors that spoke of nothing in particular. Yet here was gold woven throughout the pattern, not the harsh gold of treasure or crowns, but the gentle gold of wheat fields at harvest, of honey dripping from the comb, of late afternoon sunlight filtering through olive leaves. Helen lifted the lamp closer, studying her own work as if it belonged to a stranger. The pattern emerged slowly in the better light. Not the formal designs she had learned as a girl in Sparta, all geometric precision and royal symbols, but something more organic, more alive. She saw now that she had woven Troy into this cloth without knowing it. Here was the curve of the great wall as seen from her window. There the spiral of smoke rising from the temple fires. Her hands had been recording what her eyes saw daily, what her heart had learned to love in the patient accumulation of ordinary mornings and evenings. The Helen who had begun this tapestry was not the same woman who studied it now by lamplight. She moved to another frame, where a smaller piece waited unfinished. This one she remembered starting after a particularly difficult day when homesickness had struck her like a physical blow. She had intended to weave something of Sparta, something to remind her of the life she had left behind. But looking at it now, she saw that even her nostalgia had been transformed. The patterns that had seemed like memories of her homeland were actually Troy seen through the lens of longing. Not longing for elsewhere, but longing to belong more completely to this place that had slowly, quietly claimed her. The distant sound of guards changing watch drifted through her shuttered window, a sound that had once seemed foreign and now felt as natural as her own breathing. Helen set down the lamp and let her hands move across the various works that surrounded her. Each piece told the story of her transformation, though she had been unconscious of the telling. Here was a length of linen she had embroidered with tiny flowers, not the formal roses of Spartan royal work, but the wild blooms that grew in Troy's courtyards, the small, persistent beauties that pushed through cracks in stone walls. When had she learned to see such things? When had she begun to find them worthy of preservation in thread and careful stitches? She remembered the woman who had first entered this chamber, how she had stood before the empty loom like an exile before a foreign altar, that Helen had approached weaving as duty, as a way to fill the hollow hours of displacement. She had woven then with the mechanical precision of someone performing a role, creating the kind of work expected of a king's wife, beautiful but impersonal, skilled but somehow lifeless. But these pieces surrounding her now, they breathed with something different. They carried the rhythm of Troy's daily life, the particular quality of light that fell through her windows, the specific shades of blue visible from the palace walls when the sea caught the morning sun just so. Without intending to, she had been weaving herself into this place, thread by careful thread. Helen picked up a shuttle wound with cream-colored wool, the same shade as the limestone of Troy's walls when the sun struck them at midday. She had not chosen this color consciously, yet here it was, appearing again and again in her work, like a signature she had written without knowing her own hand. the Helen of legend, the Helen of the songs and stories, would never have noticed such a thing. That Helen lived in broad strokes of passion and betrayal, of divine beauty and mortal consequence. But this Helen, the one who stood in the lamplight surrounded by her patient work, had learned to find meaning in smaller things. She had discovered that there was a particular satisfaction in matching thread to thread, in building pattern row by careful row, in creating something that would outlast the day of its making. This was not the grand gesture of running away with Paris, but it was perhaps more truly her own choice, the decision to pay attention, to care about the quality of light and the texture of wool, to let her hands record what her heart was slowly learning. From the chest where she kept her threads came the familiar smell of cedar and dried lavender, scents that had once seemed exotic and were now simply the smell of her own space, her own things. She realized that she had been expecting to remain forever foreign here, forever the woman from elsewhere who had brought disruption in her wake. But these tapestries told a different story, the story of someone who had put down roots without noticing, who had learned to see beauty in this particular place, who had found ways to contribute to the daily texture of life rather than simply disrupting it. Outside, the night birds called from the walls, their voices carrying across the sleeping city. Helen touched the edge of her newest piece, a work she had begun just days ago. Even this showed the change. The colors were bolder now, more confident. She was no longer trying to disappear into neutral tones or copy patterns from her past. She was creating something that had never existed before, something that could only have been made by her hands in this place, at this particular moment in time. The woman who had fled Sparta had been running towards something she could not name. Now, surrounded by the evidence of her own patient creativity, she began to understand what she had been seeking. Not the dramatic transformation promised by passion, but the quieter metamorphosis that came from paying attention, from caring for small things day after day until they accumulated into a life. Helen blew out the lamp and stood for a moment in the darkness, her hands still tingling from the touch of wool and silk. Tomorrow she would return to this room, would pick up her shuttle and continue the work that was never quite finished. But tonight she carried with her the recognition of her own voice emerging through years of daily practice, the understanding that she had been writing her own story all along, one thread at a time, in a language she was only now learning to read. Hector moved through the sleeping streets of Troy like a man discovering his own city for the first time. The moon hung full above the limestone walls, casting everything in silver and deep shadow, transforming familiar corners into something almost magical. He had walked these streets countless times, but tonight they seemed to hold secrets he had never noticed, stories written in the very stones beneath his feet. The sound of water trickling in the fountain at the center of the residential quarter drew him forward. During the day, this space bustled with children playing, women drawing water, merchants calling their wares. Now it lay peaceful under the stars, the fountain's gentle music the only sound except for his own careful steps on the worn cobblestones. A small wooden horse lay abandoned beside the fountain's edge, a child's toy, carved with loving attention to detail. Hector picked it up, running his thumb over the smooth wood, feeling the care that had gone into its making. Someone had spent hours on this simple thing, had shaped it with the patience that comes from love. The child who owned it had left it here in complete trust that it would be safe until morning, that Troy was a place where small treasures could be left unguarded. From the houses around the square came the gentle sounds of sleep, the soft breathing of families at rest, the occasional murmur of a dreaming voice, the rustle of bedclothes as someone turned in their sleep. These sounds, Hector realized, were what he truly fought to protect. Not the abstract idea of Troy, not the glory of the royal house, but this particular collection of breathing, dreaming people who trusted him to keep them safe. He set the wooden horse carefully back where he had found it and continued his walk, moving deeper into the residential quarter where the houses pressed close together, where families of craftsmen and traders and farmers lived their quiet lives. The night air carried the scent of jasmine from hidden gardens, mixed with the lingering smells of the evening meal. Bread baked that morning, lamb roasted over careful fires, herbs grown in small plots behind the houses. In one doorway, he paused to look at sandals lined up neatly beside the threshold, a father's large pair, a mother's smaller ones, and 3 pairs that belonged to children, each successively tinier than the last. The sight struck him with unexpected force. Here was a family that expected to wake tomorrow, that had prepared for another ordinary day by the simple act of leaving their shoes ready for morning. A cat slipped between his legs and disappeared into an alley, part of the city's nightlife that most people never saw. Hector followed the narrow passage, emerging into a small courtyard where laundry hung on lines between the buildings. Even in the moonlight, he could see the care with which the clothes had been hung, tunics smoothed flat, children's garments arranged by size, everything positioned to catch the morning sun. From an open window above came the sound of peaceful snoring, and Hector found himself smiling. The man who slept so soundly probably had no idea that his prince walked beneath his window, that the heir to Troy's throne was spending the night hours learning to see his own city with fresh eyes. That was as it should be. The whole point of Hector's vigilance was to preserve this unconscious trust, this ability to sleep without fear. He discovered a small garden tucked between 2 houses, where night-blooming flowers released their perfume into the darkness. Someone had planted this garden with love, had chosen plants that would bring beauty even in the dark hours. Hector knelt and touched one of the pale blossoms, marveling at the delicate petals, the way the flower had opened itself to the night. His path took him through varying neighborhoods, past the quarter where the metal workers lived, where even now the forges were banked but still warm, past the area where the weavers had their workshops, where the smell of dyed wool lingered in the air. Each district had its own character, its own particular rhythm of life, but all were united by the same quality of peaceful rest. From the higher streets, he could catch glimpses of the sea beyond Troy's walls, dark water stretching to the horizon where no enemy ships disturbed the night. The Greeks had been gone for weeks now, but Hector knew better than to trust in their absence. Still, tonight, the sea lay empty and peaceful, reflecting the stars like scattered silver coins. The city itself seemed to breathe around him, the limestone walls exhaling the day's warmth into the cool night air. Hector pressed his palm against one of the ancient stones, feeling the solidity of it, the way it had stood firm against time and weather and the threats of enemies. These walls had protected generations of Trojans, had sheltered the births and deaths and daily lives of countless families. He remembered playing in these very streets as a child, remembered the games of war that had seemed so glorious then. Now he understood that the real glory was not in the fighting, but in what the fighting preserved. The right of children to play safely, the right of families to sleep without fear, the right of ordinary people to build their small, precious lives without interference. His circular path brought him back to the central fountain where the wooden horse still waited for its young owner. Hector sat on the fountain's edge and listened to the water's gentle music, letting the peace of the sleeping city settle into his bones. Tomorrow would bring its duties and challenges, its weight of responsibility, and the constant awareness of threats beyond the walls. But tonight, in this perfect stillness, he felt the deep satisfaction of understanding his purpose with complete clarity. He was not just a warrior or a prince. He was the guardian of this particular collection of dreams, the protector of these specific sleeping breaths, the keeper of a trust that was both simple and profound. The night birds called from the walls, their voices carrying across the rooftops like a lullaby for the sleeping city. Hector rose and began his journey back to the palace, but he walked slowly, reluctant to leave this perfect moment of understanding. He had discovered something precious in these quiet streets, the knowledge that his life's work was not about glory or honor in the abstract, but about ensuring that tomorrow morning a child would find his wooden horse waiting safely by the fountain, exactly where trust had left it. Chryses sat surrounded by the accumulated treasures of a lifetime, though anyone else might have seen only scraps and remnants scattered across her small chamber. Her aged fingers moved through piles of fabric pieces with the reverence of a priestess tending sacred objects, each fragment holding its own story, its own small piece of Troy's peaceful years. Here was a piece of blue wool, soft as a lamb's ear, cut from the cloak she had made for her grandson when he took his first steps. She could still see him toddling across the courtyard in that little cloak, his chubby hands reaching for butterflies, his laughter echoing off the stone walls. The wool had come from sheep that grazed in Troy's high pastures, and she had spun it herself during the long winter evenings, her wheel turning steadily while snow fell outside her window. Beside it lay a square of cream linen, fine as silk and smooth as river stones. This was from her daughter's wedding dress, the gown that had taken months to complete. Every stitch had been placed with prayers for happiness, every seam finished with the kind of care that could only come from a mother's love. She remembered her daughter standing for the final fitting, how the linen had caught the light from the oil lamps and made her skin glow like pearl. Her fingers found a rougher piece, brown wool, sturdy and practical. This was from the work tunics she had sewn for the harvest crews, garments made to withstand long days in the fields to protect the men who brought in Troy's grain. She had made dozens of these tunics over the years, each one a small act of service to the city's well-being. The wool still carried the faint scent of wheat and sunshine, memories woven into the very fibers. The storage chest beside her bed released its familiar fragrance each time she opened it. Cedar wood and dried lavender, the smell of careful preservation. Chryses had been saving these pieces for years, telling herself she would use them for quilts or cushions, but now she understood their true purpose. They were Troy's real archive, a record of love made tangible in thread and careful stitches. A fragment of green silk caught the lamplight, and she smiled at the memory it carried. This was from the sash she had embroidered for the spring festival when her granddaughter had danced in the temple courtyard with the other young girls. The silk had been a gift from a merchant grateful for the cloak she had mended for his son, and she had worked tiny flowers along its edges in silver thread that caught the light as the child danced. The lamp flame wavered slightly, casting dancing shadows across the collection spread before her. In this uncertain light, The fabric pieces seemed to take on lives of their own, each one whispering its story of the hands that had worn it, the occasions that had called it into being, the love that had shaped it from raw wool or linen into something useful and beautiful. Through her shuttered window came the gentle sounds of Troy at rest, the distant call of night guards, the soft hoot of an owl in the palace gardens, the whisper of wind through the olive trees. These sounds had become the soundtrack of her contentment, the audio signature of a life lived in safety and community. She picked up a piece of rough hemp cloth, the kind used for grain sacks and work aprons. Even this humble fabric carried its own dignity in her hands. She had used such cloth to make aprons for the kitchen servants, simple garments that had protected fine tunics from oil stains and flour dust. Every piece of clothing, no matter how humble, had been made with the same attention to detail, the same commitment to doing work that would last. A small square of fine linen drew her attention, its surface covered with delicate embroidery in colors that seemed to glow in the lamplight. This was from the altar cloth she had made for her son's wedding, a piece that had taken her months to complete. Each tiny stitch had been a prayer for the young couple's happiness, each flower and vine a symbol of growth and abundance. Her fingers traced a piece of soft cotton, worn thin with washing and use. This was from her own everyday tunic, the one she had worn while teaching her granddaughter to sew, while tending her small garden, while going about the 1,000 small tasks that made up a life. The fabric had molded itself to her body over years of wear, had absorbed the oils of her skin and the scents of her daily work. As she sorted through the collection, Chryseis marveled at the variety of textures beneath her fingers, smooth silk and rough wool, fine linen and sturdy hemp, soft cotton and crisp taffeta. Each fabric had its own character, its own proper use, its own way of taking dye and holding stitches. Learning to work with these different materials had been like learning different languages, each one requiring its own vocabulary of techniques and tools. The pieces seemed to organize themselves by seasons as she handled them, light linens from summer garments, warm wools from winter cloaks, the bright colors favored for spring festivals, the rich earth tones chosen for autumn celebrations. Her life in Troy had been measured not just in years, but in the cycle of seasons, each one bringing its own tasks and pleasures, its own reasons for creating new garments or mending old ones. She began to see patterns in her collection that went beyond color or fabric type, pieces that connected family members across generations, fabrics that had been passed from mother to daughter to granddaughter. A scrap of blue wool from her own wedding dress lay next to a piece from her daughter's, and nearby was silk from the sash her granddaughter would wear at her own wedding someday. As the night deepened around her, Chryseis understood that what she held in her lap was more than just fabric scraps. These pieces represented the accumulated tenderness of years spent caring for others, the patient love that builds a life one small act at a time. Each fragment was proof that she had been here, that she had contributed something valuable to the world, that her hands had created beauty and comfort for the people she loved. The Greeks might come with their swords and their fires, might destroy the walls and topple the towers, but they could never take this. The memory of love made manifest in careful stitches, the record of a life spent in service to others, the proof that ordinary acts of creation could be as lasting and valuable as any monument carved in stone. Chryseis began to fold the pieces carefully, returning them to their chest with the reverence they deserved. Tomorrow she would continue her work, would pick up her needle and thread and add to this collection of love made tangible. But tonight, surrounded by the evidence of her life's work, she felt the deep satisfaction of understanding her own worth, her own contribution to the great tapestry of human care that made Troy not just a city, but a home. Deiphobus stood at the highest point of Troy's great wall, where the stone parapet had been worn smooth by generations of guards who had kept their vigil in this same spot. The pre-dawn air moved across the heights with a coolness that spoke of the sea's proximity, carrying with it the salt scent of distant waves and the green smell of the plain that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Below him, Troy slept in perfect peace, the city spread out like a child in peaceful slumber. From this height, he could see the gentle rise and fall of rooftops, the dark squares of courtyards where fountains caught starlight, the narrow streets that wound between houses where families dreamed safely behind their doors. The sight filled him with something deeper than pride, a fierce protective tenderness that seemed to expand his chest with each breath. The stars were beginning to fade as the sky lightened almost imperceptibly in the east. Deiphobus had stood watch through the darkest hours when the night pressed closest and the responsibility felt heaviest on his shoulders. Now, as dawn approached, he felt the satisfaction of another night successfully guarded, another period of safety delivered to the sleeping city below. The sound of waves against Troy's shore reached him even at this height, a constant rhythm that had become as natural as his own heartbeat. The sea that brought traders and prosperity to Troy could also bring enemies, but tonight it lay empty and peaceful, reflecting the last of the starlight like scattered silver. No ships disturbed its surface, no threat approached from the water that had so often been Troy's highway to the wider world. He rested his hands on the parapet, feeling the solidity of the stone beneath his palms. These walls had stood for generations, had protected his father and his father's father, had sheltered the births and deaths and daily lives of countless Trojans. The stone was warm still from the previous day's sun, holding heat like a promise that morning would come again, that the cycle of day and night would continue as it always had. From somewhere along the walls came the call of night birds, their voices carrying across the battlements like messages passed between centuries. Deiphobus had learned to distinguish between their different calls, to read in their songs the subtle changes that marked the passage of night toward dawn. They were his companions in these solitary hours, fellow guardians of the sleeping city. The weight of his duty settled on him not as burden, but as privilege, the recognition that he had been entrusted with something infinitely precious. Every person sleeping safely below, every child dreaming in a warm bed, every mother resting peacefully beside her husband, every old man snoring gently in his chair, depended on his vigilance, on his willingness to stand watch while they surrendered to sleep's vulnerability. Troy itself seemed to breathe around him, the limestone walls expanding and contracting slightly with the temperature changes, the whole structure alive with the subtle movements of a living thing. He had grown up within these walls, had learned to walk on these stones, had played as a child in the courtyards that now lay dark and quiet below. The city was not just his responsibility, but his home in the deepest sense, the place where his roots went down into bedrock. Standing here in the growing light, Deiphobus understood that his role as guardian was not something imposed from outside, but something that had grown naturally from his love for this particular place and these particular people. He did not stand watch because duty demanded it, but because love required it, because the thought of harm coming to the sleeping city below was unthinkable, unbearable. The great plain stretched away from Troy's walls, empty now, but marked with the scars of old battles, the earthworks where armies had camped, the burned patches where siege engines had stood. During the day, this emptiness felt like victory, proof that Troy's enemies had been driven away. But in these quiet hours before dawn, it felt more like a held breath, a pause between movements in a song not yet finished. From this vantage point, he could see details of the city that were invisible from ground level, the way the streets formed patterns like a vast tapestry, the careful planning that had gone into Troy's construction, the way each district fitted perfectly with its neighbors to form a harmonious whole. This bird's-eye view gave him a god's perspective on the human community he protected, helped him understand the intricate connections that bound Troy's people together. The trust that the sleeping city placed in him was absolute and unspoken. No one below questioned whether he would be here, whether he would maintain his vigil through the dark hours. They slept with the unconscious confidence that someone was watching, that their safety was being guarded by eyes that never closed, by a devotion that required no acknowledgement or reward. The eastern sky was definitely lighter now, though the sun had not yet appeared. Soon the city would begin to wake, first the bakers, then the farmers heading to their fields, then the gradual stirring of family life as another day began. Deiphobus would remain at his post until the full light of day made his vigil unnecessary, until Troy's own activity provided its protection. In these last moments of his night watch, he felt the profound satisfaction of duty perfectly fulfilled, of love expressed through faithful service. Some forms of devotion, he understood, required no witnesses, no recognition, no glory. The greatest acts of love were often the most invisible. The willingness to stay awake while others slept, to stand guard at the edges of safety, to maintain the boundaries that allowed ordinary life to flourish. As the first hint of sunrise touched the eastern horizon, Deiphobus felt the deep peace that came from knowing his place in the world, from understanding that his life had meaning and purpose beyond himself. He was not just a prince of Troy, but a guardian of dreams, a protector of the vulnerable hours when the city lay open to the night. This was his calling, his sacred trust, his gift to the people who slept safely below, the promise that someone would always be watching, always be ready, always be there when the darkness pressed closest and the need for protection was greatest. The young guard, Alexios was his name, though few in the palace knew it, found himself drawn to the corner of the gardens where the night-blooming jasmine released its sweetest perfume into the darkness. His rounds had brought him here 3 times already this evening, and each time he had lingered a moment longer than duty required. He set his spear carefully against the worn stone bench and sat, feeling the coolness of the marble through his simple tunic. The bench bore the smooth depression of countless other guards who had rested here over the years, their bodies wearing the stone into a perfect cradle for tired shoulders and weary backs. Tonight felt different, not dangerous. He had felt danger before, the electric tension that preceded battle, the way the very air seemed to sharpen when enemies approached. This was something else entirely. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, not in fear, but in a kind of sacred anticipation, the way a mother holds her breath, watching her child sleep. From where he sat, Alexios could hear the gentle sounds of Troy at rest, the soft closing of a shutter somewhere in the palace, the distant murmur of night servants moving through corridors, the almost inaudible sound of thousands of people breathing in peaceful sleep. These were the sounds he had been born to protect, though he had never understood that quite so clearly before. He thought of his father, a blacksmith who had died when Alexios was barely old enough to hold a sword properly. His father had never been a guard, never stood watch over anything more precious than his forge and his tools, but he had taught Alexios something that only now, in this garden, made perfect sense. "Every honest work," his father had said, hammering out a horseshoe in the red glow of the coals, "is a prayer. Every careful thing you make with your hands is a way of saying the world matters." Sitting here now, his own hands resting on his knees, Alexios understood that his father had been teaching him about love disguised as duty. The careful way his father had shaped each piece of metal, testing its strength, ensuring it would serve its purpose. That was the same attention Alexios brought to his rounds, the same devotion he felt when he checked each gate, each shadowed corner, each vulnerable approach to the sleeping city. He was 19 years old, barely a man by most measures, yet Troy had trusted him with this, to walk her walls in darkness, to be her eyes when her people could not keep their own open. The weight of that trust had seemed overwhelming when he first took up his spear. Now, 3 years into his service, he was beginning to understand that the weight was not a burden, but a gift. In the daylight hours, when the city bustled with merchants and children and the endless business of living, Alexios sometimes felt invisible. He was just another young soldier, unremarkable among the hundreds who served Troy's army. But here, in these quiet hours when the city slept, he was essential. He was the thin line between Troy's dreams and the darkness that pressed against her walls. The night-blooming flowers around him seemed to understand something about patience, about the value of beauty that revealed itself only when the world grew quiet. They spent their days as modest green plants, unremarkable among the garden's more showy blooms. But when darkness fell, they opened themselves completely, offering their sweetness to the night air, asking nothing in return but the chance to give what they had been made to give. Perhaps that was what his father had been trying to tell him about prayer and honest work. Perhaps the jasmine flowers were the truest guards of all, keeping their vigil not with spears and armor, but with beauty, with the simple insistence that even in darkness, even in the hours when no one was watching, there were things worth tending, worth protecting, worth keeping alive. Alexios picked up his spear and stood, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon in his hand. But tonight, for the first time, the spear felt less like a tool of war and more like a gardener's stake, something to help beautiful things grow straight and strong, something to support what was already reaching toward the light. As he resumed his rounds, moving along the carefully tended paths between flower beds and herb gardens, he found himself noticing details that had escaped him before. The way someone, probably one of the palace gardeners, had staked the young olive trees so they would grow without bending, the small stones placed around the base of the fountain to prevent erosion, the careful pruning of the rose bushes done with such skill that even in darkness he could see how each cut had been made to encourage new growth. Everything in this garden spoke of faith in tomorrow. The gardeners who tended these plants did so believing there would be another season, another year, another generation to enjoy what they had planted. It was the same faith that kept him walking these rounds, the same trust that let Troy's people sleep peacefully while he kept watch. He thought of Helen, whom he had glimpsed earlier that evening, standing at her window with such stillness that she seemed to be listening to something only she could hear. There were those who blamed her for Troy's troubles, who whispered that her beauty had brought nothing but war to their city. But watching her tonight, Alexios had seen something different. A woman who understood, perhaps better than anyone, the weight of being responsible for something precious and fragile. She too was keeping a kind of vigil, he realized. Her presence in Troy was its own form of guard duty, her willingness to stay and face whatever came a kind of courage that had nothing to do with spears or shields. She was protecting something too, not walls or gates, but the idea that love, even complicated love, even love that brought danger, was worth defending. As Alexios completed his circuit of the gardens and prepared to check the outer walls, he carried with him a new understanding of his place in Troy's story. He was not just a guard, he was a keeper of faith, a tender of the city's dreams. His rounds were a kind of prayer, his vigilance a form of love made visible in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. There would be other nights, other rounds, other opportunities to stand between Troy and the dark. But tonight, this night, he was exactly where he belonged. A young man with a spear and a purpose, walking carefully through a garden where jasmine bloomed in darkness, keeping watch over a city that had trusted him with its dreams. Helen stood at her window, her reflection ghost-like in the bronze mirror of night. The silk curtains barely stirred in the pre-dawn air that carried the scent of cooling stone and distant sea salt. Below, Troy slept in perfect silence, broken only by the soft footfall of guards making their rounds. She had been watching the Greek ships for hours now, those distant points of light scattered across the Scamander plain like stars fallen to earth. The olive oil lamps flickered low behind her, casting wavering shadows on painted walls that depicted peaceful pastoral scenes. Shepherds with their flocks, women gathering grain, children playing beneath olive trees. How strange that such images of serenity should decorate the chamber of the woman for whom a war had been fought. But perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps the painters had understood something she was only now beginning to grasp. She touched the Trojan jewelry at her throat, gifts from Paris now cold in his tomb these many months. The gold was warm from her skin, but it felt heavier tonight, weighted with the years she had worn it. 10 years in Troy, 10 years of being Helen of Troy rather than Helen of Sparta, though she wondered now if she had ever truly been either. The realization came not as pain, but as a strange relief. She understood now that she had never been the author of her own story. Not when she had left Sparta with Paris, her heart full of what she had thought was love, but might have been merely the intoxication of choice. Not in these 10 years in Troy, when she had tried to make herself useful, to justify the war that raged beyond the walls in her name. The ships waited like patient hunters, but she felt herself changing even as she watched them. She was no longer prey. She was simply a woman who had learned to find peace in the margins of myth, in the small spaces between other people's desires where a person might discover who they actually were. The horizon showed the faintest suggestion of coming light, a pale thread of gold that would soon spread across the sky. She thought of Menelaus, her first husband, somewhere among those ships. Did he still dream of her as she had been 20 years ago? Did he understand that the woman he sought to reclaim had never truly existed, had been as much a creation of others' needs as Helen of Troy had become? She moved away from the window and sat at her dressing table, where a polished bronze mirror reflected her face in the lamplight. The years showed there, not harshly, for she had been blessed with enduring beauty, but with a depth that had not been there in her youth. Lines around her eyes spoke of laughter and sorrow both, of nights spent comforting Trojan women who had lost sons and husbands in her war. Her war. Even now she could not quite accept that phrase. Wars belonged to kings and heroes, to men who chose their battles. But she had learned that sometimes a person could become a war without choosing it, could find themselves transformed into a symbol that bore only passing resemblance to the woman who woke each morning and braided her hair and broke her fast with bread and honey. She picked up her ivory comb and began to work it through her hair with slow, meditative strokes. This was real. The weight of her hair in her hands, the smooth coolness of the ivory, the familiar ritual that connected her to countless other women performing the same act at the same hour. In such moments, she felt most herself, most human. From somewhere in the city came the sound of early morning prayers, the voices of old women who rose before dawn to tend the sacred fires. They prayed for their sons, their husbands, their city. Did they pray for her too, she wondered, or did they see her only as the cause of their sorrows? But she had learned not to carry the weight of others' judgments. She had tried, in her years here, to be worthy of Troy's protection. She had tended the wounded, comforted the grieving, used her beauty and her position to secure food and medicine when the siege pressed hardest. She had loved Paris truly, if not wisely, and mourned him genuinely when Menelaus's arrow found its mark. Now, in these final hours, for she sensed somehow that these were final hours, though she could not have said why, she felt a curious lightness. She had done what she could with the life that had been given to her, with the choices that had been available. She had not chosen to be beautiful, had not chosen to be desired by princes, had not chosen to become the face that launched 1,000 ships. But she had chosen, within those constraints, to be kind when she could, to be useful when possible, to find moments of genuine connection with the people around her. The light was growing stronger now. Soon the city would wake fully, and the day would begin with all its familiar rhythms. The bakers would tend their ovens, the craftsmen would open their workshops, children would run through the streets with their morning energy. Life would continue, as it always did, in the spaces between the great events that historians would remember. She rose and moved to her clothes chest, selecting a simple robe of blue wool, Trojan made, she noted with a small smile. After 10 years, her Greek clothing had long since worn out or been given away. She was dressed now as a Trojan woman, and perhaps that was as it should be. Troy had given her sanctuary when she needed it, had made space for her in its daily life, had allowed her to be more than just a symbol. As she fastened the robe with a bronze pin shaped like a bird in flight, she thought about birds. They appeared in no one's stories except their own, followed no destiny but the ancient pull of seasons and sky. They were beautiful without meaning to be, useful without trying to be, free in ways that humans, with their complex webs of obligation and desire, could never be. But perhaps that was enough. To have been beautiful, to have been useful, to have found moments of freedom within the story others had written for her. Perhaps that was all anyone could do. Find the spaces where choice was possible and make the best choices they could within them. The ships waited, patient as stones, but she no longer felt hurried by their presence. Whatever came next would come. She had made her peace with the past and found her place in the present. The future belonged to others now, to kings and warriors, to the gods who moved mortals across the board of the world like pieces in some vast game. She was ready for whatever dawn would bring, ready to meet it not as Helen of Sparta or Helen of Troy, but simply as Helen, a woman who had learned finally to be at peace with herself. Hector climbed the stone steps to Troy's highest tower, his feet finding each worn groove in the ancient stones. His armor, polished smooth by years of war, caught the first pale light of dawn filtering through the narrow windows. The bronze plates moved with him like a second skin, familiar as breathing after so many years of wearing them. Below him, Troy spread like a sleeping child, the markets where Andromache bought bread each morning, selecting the loaves with the care of a woman who knew the value of every grain. The courtyard where Astyanax took his first uncertain steps, his small hands reaching for his father's sword hilt with the fearless curiosity of youth. The temple where old women maintained their vigil, their prayers rising like incense into the morning air. As he reached the top of the tower and looked out over the battlements, Hector understood with sudden clarity that a man's worth was not measured in the length of his life, but in the depth of his protection of what he loved. The thought came to him not as revelation, but as recognition, the way one recognizes a truth that has been growing quietly in the heart for years. The Greek ships seemed smaller from this height, less threatening, merely another element in the landscape of his duty. He had spent 10 years watching those ships, learning their positions like a farmer learns the patterns of his fields. They were as much a part of his world now as the olive groves that dotted the hills beyond the city, as familiar as the sound of his wife's voice calling his name. He thought of Andromache, still sleeping in their bed, her dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled wine. She would wake soon and reach for him, and finding the space empty, would know without looking that he had come here, to this place where he did his thinking. She understood his need for these solitary hours, these moments when he could shed the weight of being Troy's defender and simply be a man watching the sun rise over the world he had sworn to protect. The air was cool and slightly damp with morning dew. Below, he could see the first cooking fires beginning to flicker to life in the earliest rising households. The sound of a baby crying, carried up from the lower city, quickly soothed by a mother's voice. A cat picked its way carefully along a rooftop, pausing to wash its face in the growing light. The air smelled of baking bread and the distant sea, of the herbs that grew in small gardens tucked between houses, of the olive oil that burned in countless lamps throughout the city. He had been a good husband. This he knew with the certainty that comes from daily practice. He had listened when Andromache spoke of her fears, had held her when the news came of another friend's husband fallen in battle, had made space in his warrior's heart for the small domestic concerns that made up the texture of married life. He had learned to find joy in the ordinary moments, sharing a meal, watching his wife work at her loom, feeling her hand in his as they walked through the city streets. And he had been a loving father. Astyanax would not remember much of these early years, but Hector had made sure they were filled with gentleness. He had sung his son to sleep with old songs his own father had taught him, had carved wooden toys with his own hands, had lifted the boy high above his head to see the world from a warrior's height. In his son's laughter, Hector had heard the sound of Troy's future, the promise that life would continue beyond the war that had defined his generation. He had been a faithful son, too. When old Priam's voice trembled with age and sorrow, Hector had been there to steady him. When the king's judgment wavered under the weight of too many losses, Hector had provided the strength that kept Troy's walls strong. He had never questioned his father's decisions, never allowed his own doubts to undermine the authority that held their world together. The Greek ships were visible now as a dark line against the lighter sky, their masts like a forest of leafless trees. Somewhere among them, Achilles sharpened his spear and dreamed of glory. Somewhere, Agamemnon planned new strategies for breaking Troy's defenses. Somewhere, men who had never seen his wife's face or heard his son's laughter prepared to take both from him. But if the gods demanded more than he had already given, they would have to take it from hands that had held nothing back. He had spent his strength like water, poured out his life like wine at an altar. Every day for 10 years he had risen and put on his armor and walked to the walls, ready to die if necessary to keep Troy safe for one more sunrise. He thought of his brother Paris, dead these many months, and felt the familiar mixture of love and exasperation that had defined their relationship. Paris had brought this war to their doorstep, had chosen his own desire over his city's safety. But he had been Hector's brother, and in the end, that had mattered more than wisdom or judgment. Hector had fought to protect Paris too, had stood between him and the consequences of his choices because that was what brothers did. The tower stone was warming now as the sun climbed higher. Soon he would need to return to his duties, the morning inspection of the walls, the meeting with his captains, the endless small decisions that kept an army functioning. But for now, he allowed himself these moments of peace, this brief respite from the weight of command. He understood that he had achieved something more valuable than victory in battle. He had lived a life without compromise, had held nothing back in service to love. Whether Troy stood or fell, whether his name was remembered or forgotten, he had been fully present in his own life, had given everything he had to the people and place he cherished. A dove landed on the battlement near his hand, its feathers gray-white in the morning light. It looked at him with one bright eye, unafraid, before taking flight again toward the city below. Hector watched it go, carrying some message he could not read to recipients he would never know. The watch was changing below. He could hear the soft voices of guards greeting their replacements, the quiet clink of armor as men took their positions. His own watch was ending too, though he sensed it was ending in ways beyond the simple passage of hours. If this was to be his last morning on the tower, his last quiet hour before the day's demands claimed him, then he was grateful to have spent it in peace, looking out over the city he loved, feeling the weight of a life fully lived settle around his shoulders like a familiar cloak. Chryses kneaded bread dough with the same rhythm she had used for 50 years, her hands moving in the ancient pattern her mother had taught her, and her mother's mother before that. The dough was smooth and elastic beneath her palms, alive with the promise of yeast and warmth, responding to her touch with the familiarity of a conversation carried on in the same words for decades. At the household shrine in the corner of her kitchen, she had already placed a small offering of grain and spoken the old prayers for protection, the words worn smooth as river stones by repetition. The little clay figures of protective gods, Hestia of the hearth, Demeter of the grain, the household spirits, whose names were too old to remember, seemed to nod their approval in the flickering lamplight. Through the doorway to the next room, she could hear her grandchildren sleeping, their breathing soft and regular as the tide. Little Melos, barely 3, who called her Yaya and brought her flowers wilted from his small fist. Penthea, 7 and serious, who watched Chryseis work with the intensity of a child, learning the mysteries that would someday be hers to preserve. The memory came to her unbidden, her own grandmother's hands, gnarled with age but still sure as they shaped dough in this very kitchen. The old woman had hummed while she worked, wordless melodies that seemed to rise from the bread itself, ancient songs that spoke of harvest and hearth, of the endless cycle of grain becoming sustenance. Chryseis found herself humming now, the same tune emerging from some deep place in her memory, her voice barely a whisper in the pre-dawn quiet. The war, the ships, the great events of kings and princes, all of these seemed distant compared to the immediate reality of bread rising, children growing, the sun returning each morning to warm the stones of home. She had lived through wars before. When she was Penthea's age, raiders from the north had threatened the coastal cities. When she was a young mother, pirates had made the sea roads dangerous for merchants. Cities fell, cities rose, but the need for bread, for prayer, for the careful tending of small lives continued. The kitchen was warm from the banked cooking fire, its embers glowing like small suns in the darkness before dawn. Flour dusted the wooden table like fine snow, and the smell of yeast and rising dough filled the air with the promise of sustenance. This was her temple she had come to understand, not the grand structures where priests performed elaborate rituals, but this simple room where she transformed grain into bread, where she fed her family and kept the ancient contracts between human need and divine provision. She shaped the first loaf with practiced hands, her fingers creating the traditional pattern of cuts that would allow the bread to rise properly in the oven. Each movement was both practical and sacred, part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the first woman who had learned to make flour from grain, who had discovered that water and time could create the miracle of bread. The clay oil lamp on the shrine flickered, casting dancing shadows across the small figures of the gods. She paused in her work to trim the wick, her movements reverent and precise. The flame steadied, illuminating the worn faces of the deities who had watched over her family for generations. Some had been her grandmother's, others she had acquired as a young bride, each one carrying its own history of prayers answered and sorrows comforted. Through the window, the first full light of day illuminated the courtyard where herbs grew in neat rows, basil and oregano, thyme and sage, the plants that turned simple food into nourishment for both body and spirit. She had planted that garden with her own hands, had watched it grow and change through the seasons, had learned which plants thrived in sun and which preferred shade, which could be harvested freely and which must be used sparingly. Her daughter-in-law Melania would wake soon and come to help with the morning meal, bringing her own children and her own stories of the small dramas that made up neighborhood life. They would work together in comfortable silence, two women who understood that the real business of the world happened not in palaces or on battlefields, but in kitchens where food was prepared with love, where children were fed and stories were passed from one generation to the next. She thought of her son, somewhere with Hector's forces, and said a quiet prayer for his safety. But it was not the desperate prayer of a mother who had no other hope. It was the steady prayer of a woman who understood that love meant letting go, that sons must walk their own paths even when those paths led toward danger. The second loaf took shape under her hands, and then the third, each one slightly different, marked by the particular pressure of her fingers, the slight variations in the dough that made each loaf unique despite following the same ancient recipe. Like children, she thought, formed by the same love and care, but each one becoming themselves in ways that could not be predicted or controlled. The household was beginning to stir now. She could hear Melos's sleepy voice asking for water, and Penthea's patient response as she helped her little brother. Soon they would come padding into the kitchen on bare feet, drawn by the smell of baking bread and the promise of honey cakes she always made on mornings when the bread was fresh. She placed the loaves in the stone oven, feeling the heat on her face like a blessing. The bread would bake while she prepared the rest of the morning meal: goat cheese and olives, dried figs saved from last autumn's harvest, the small feast that marked the beginning of each day in her household. This was enough. She understood now in the way that comes only with age and experience. This careful tending of daily life, this preservation of the small rituals that connected human beings to each other and to the divine, this was not a lesser thing than the grand gestures that made their way into songs and stories. This was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Her hands shaped the final loaf, and in that simple act, she found all the meaning the world required. The bread would feed her family, would bring them together around the table, would remind them that they were loved and cared for. And tomorrow she would rise again and knead dough again and speak the old prayers again, part of the endless cycle that kept the world turning, kept life flowing like a river that found its way around every obstacle. The sun was fully up now, painting the kitchen walls with golden light. Somewhere in the city, great events were unfolding, but here in her kitchen, surrounded by the tools of her trade and the evidence of her love, Chryseis had found the peace that comes from understanding one's place in the larger pattern, the quiet satisfaction of work well done and life fully lived. The young guard walked his familiar route through Troy's winding streets, but this morning everything seemed touched with particular clarity, as if the world had been washed clean by the night's gentle dreams. His leather sandals made soft sounds on the worn stones, a rhythm he had learned by heart during his months of service, the cadence of protection made manifest in simple movement. In the market square, vendors were arranging their goods with the same care they had shown for years. Pottery glazed in blues and greens that caught the morning light, cloth woven in patterns that spoke of distant places and ancient traditions, dried fish from the harbor that would feed families throughout the city. The familiar sight filled him with something deeper than contentment, a recognition of the ordinary miracle that was daily life continuing undisturbed. Children ran between the stalls, their laughter echoing off stone walls that had heard such sounds for generations. A little girl with dark braids chased a boy who clutched a wooden toy horse to his chest, both of them weaving through the adult world with the confidence of those who knew themselves to be loved and protected. Their mothers watched with the half-attention of women who had learned to balance vigilance with trust, who understood that children must be allowed to explore the boundaries of their safety. He remembered being one of those children, racing through these same streets with his friend Alexios, both of them dreaming of becoming warriors like the heroes in the old songs. Alexios had joined the army 2 years before him and now served on the outer walls, his boyhood dreams transformed into the daily reality of watching and waiting. They still nodded to each other when their paths crossed, but something had changed in the transition from play to purpose, from imagination to responsibility. He passed the temple where old women maintained their vigil, their voices rising and falling in prayers that had been spoken in this place since before his grandfather's time. The words were familiar to him now, having heard them every morning for months. Prayers for sons and husbands, for the city's walls to hold strong, for the harvest to be abundant, for the simple grace of another day's peace. The workshops were opening as he walked by, the bronze smith already at his forge, shaping metal that would become tools and ornaments, and the 1,000 useful things that made civilization possible. The potter at her wheel, her hands guiding clay into forms that would hold water and wine and oil. The weaver at her loom, creating cloth that would become clothing and curtains, and the sails of ships that would carry Troy's goods to distant ports. The bronze smith looked up as he passed and raised a hand in greeting. The man's face was already streaked with soot, his leather apron stained from years of working with fire and metal. Behind him, apprentices pumped the bellows that kept the forge burning hot, their movements synchronized like dancers who had learned the same steps. The ring of hammer on anvil would soon fill the air, the sound of human skill transforming raw material into objects of beauty and utility. In the gardens tucked between houses, young mothers tended both plants and babies with equal devotion. He watched one woman, barely older than himself, as she showed her toddler how to water the herbs that grew in neat rows, basil and oregano, thyme and sage. The child held the small watering pot with intense concentration, understanding somehow that this was important work, that the care of growing things was a sacred trust. At each familiar corner, he felt the weight of protection settling more deeply into his understanding. It was not the dramatic protection of battle, though he was prepared for that if it came. It was the quiet protection of routine, of allowing ordinary life to continue undisturbed, of maintaining the space where children could play, and mothers could tend their gardens and craftsmen could pursue their trades without fear. He thought of the stories the older guards told, tales of heroes and great deeds, of warriors who had won immortal fame through acts of extraordinary courage. But walking through Troy in the morning light, he began to understand that there was another kind of heroism, quieter but no less real. The heroism of the baker who rose before dawn to ensure fresh bread for his neighbors, of the midwife who attended difficult births, of the teacher who passed knowledge from one generation to the next. Troy slept and woke, worked and rested, loved and mourned in the rhythm that made a place home. The rhythm was not perfect. There was sorrow here too, loss and disappointment, and the small tragedies that marked every human life. But there was also joy and beauty, and the endless creativity that human beings brought to the simple act of living together in community. Near the fountain where women came to draw water, he paused to watch the morning ritual. The women moved with practiced efficiency, but they also lingered to share news and gossip, to check on each other's families, to maintain the web of connections that held the community together. Their voices created a gentle music, punctuated by the splash of water and the soft laughter that came from shared understanding. The fountain itself was a work of art, carved from white marble that had been brought from quarries in the distant mountains. Water flowed from the mouth of a stone lion, the sculpture worn smooth by countless hands that had touched it while drawing water. Moss grew in the crevices where the stone met the ground, and small birds came to drink from the overflow that pooled at the fountain's base. An old man sat in the shade nearby, carving a piece of wood with careful strokes. The guard had seen him there many mornings, always working on some small project, a toy for a grandchild, a tool for his household, a decorative piece that served no purpose except to please the eye. The man looked up and nodded as the guard passed, a simple acknowledgement between two people who understood their roles in the larger pattern of the city's life. The morning light revealed details he had never noticed before. The way ivy grew up the walls of certain houses, creating natural tapestries of green. The careful arrangement of potted plants on rooftops where families grew vegetables and flowers, the worn patches in the stone steps where generations of feet had passed, each person adding their small contribution to the patina of use that marked a place as truly lived in. His watch was ending, but the city's life continued, as it had, as it would. The sun climbed higher, warming the stones and bringing color to the painted walls that decorated houses and shops throughout Troy. Flowers bloomed in window boxes and small courtyards, roses and jasmine, lavender and mint, the plants that made even the humblest dwelling beautiful. The Greek ships were visible from the higher streets, a dark line on the horizon that spoke of other possibilities, other futures. But here, in the heart of Troy, surrounded by the evidence of human care and creativity, they seemed less threatening than they had in the darkness before dawn. Whatever came, this would remain, the knowledge of what human beings could create when they worked together, when they chose to build rather than destroy. A cat emerged from an alley, stretching in the morning sun before padding silently across the street. It paused to investigate a basket of fish scraps left by a vendor, then continued on its way with the unhurried confidence of a creature that knew itself to be at home. Even the animals, he thought, were part of this larger community, finding their place in the intricate web of relationships that made the city whole. As he completed his final circuit and prepared to report to his commander, the young guard carried with him a new understanding of what it meant to be a protector. It was not just about standing ready to fight, though that remained important. It was about preserving the space for normal life to flourish, about maintaining the conditions that allowed children to play and craftsmen to work and families to gather around their tables in peace. The beauty and resilience of ordinary human community. This was what he guarded. This was what made his service meaningful. In the laughter of children and the prayers of old women, in the careful work of artisans and the patient love of mothers, he had found the true treasure of Troy, the thing that made it worth defending against any threat. The night watch was ending. Deiphobus stood at the eastern wall of the great courtyard, watching as the first pale light touched the highest towers of Troy. His bronze helmet, polished to mirror brightness, reflected the dawn back to the sky. But he was no longer thinking of war or watch duties or the distant ships that had become as familiar as the mountains beyond the plain. He lifted the helmet from his head, feeling the cool air move through his dark hair. The metal was warm from his body heat, and he held it against his chest like something precious. Around him, the palace was beginning its daily resurrection. Servants padding across the stone with bare feet, carrying water jars that caught and scattered the new light, their soft voices mixing with the sound of birds settling in the eaves. This was the hour he had come to love most during his months of night duty. Not the dramatic darkness when every shadow might hide an enemy, not the deep middle hours when time seemed suspended between one day and the next, but this gentle transition when Troy emerged from sleep like a woman rising from her bed, unhurried and beautiful. A cat picked its way across the courtyard, pausing to wash itself in a patch of sunlight. Deiphobus watched it with the attention he might once have given to enemy movements, noting how it moved with perfect confidence through space it knew completely. The cat belonged here, as the stones belonged, as the cypress trees belonged, as he himself belonged. From the women's quarters came the sound of Helen's voice, though he could not make out her words. She was speaking to one of her servants, probably choosing which dress to wear, which jewelry might catch the morning light. He thought of his sister-in-law's hands moving through silk and gold, the small decisions that shaped a day, the casual assumption that there would be many more days just like this one. In the distance, beyond the great gates that stood open to welcome the morning, he could see the city stirring. Smoke rose from cooking fires, straight columns in the still air. A merchant was already calling his wares, fresh bread, honey, oil pressed from the first olives. Children's voices carried on the breeze, high and clear as birdsong. Deiphobus breathed in the familiar scents of Troy. Stone warmed by sun, olive oil, bread baking, the green smell of the gardens where his mother grew herbs for the kitchen. These were the smells of home, as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. He had been born breathing this air, had learned to walk on these stones, had grown from boy to man within these walls. The guard changing was happening with the quiet efficiency of long practice. His replacement, young Lycaon, approached with respectful silence, understanding that this transition from night to day was sacred in its own way. They exchanged the ritual words. The watch is kept. The watch is kept. But both knew the deeper truth. Troy herself was the watch. Troy herself was the guardian. Troy herself was what they protected and what protected them. From Hector's quarters came the sound of a child's laughter. Little Astyanax, probably climbing on his father's back, demanding to be thrown into the air and caught again. Deiphobus smiled, remembering his own childhood games with Hector, how his older brother had always been patient with his questions, his need to understand everything, to find the pattern beneath the surface of things. Andromache would be there too, probably pretending to scold, but unable to hide her delight in seeing her husband and son together. The three of them made a complete world, as perfect and self-contained as the cat washing itself in the courtyard, as the cypress trees reaching toward the light, as Troy herself rising from sleep. The Greek ships were still there on the horizon, dark shapes against the brightening sky. They had been there so long now that they seemed part of the natural order, like distant mountains or the line where sea met sky. Deiphobus could remember when their arrival had sent the city into panic, when every man had rushed to the walls to stare at the enemy fleet. Now they were simply there, part of the landscape of his daily life. He thought of the men on those ships, probably waking to their own morning routines, their own small rituals of bread and wine, their own memories of home. They too were someone's sons, someone's brothers, someone's beloved. They too had learned to walk somewhere, had breathed familiar air, had known the comfort of belonging to a place that knew them completely. But that understanding, which might once have troubled him, now brought only a deeper peace. He was not responsible for their choices, their griefs, their long exile from home. He was responsible only for this, for standing watch over what he loved, for being present to this moment, for receiving the gift of another morning in Troy. The sun climbed higher, painting the courtyard walls gold and amber. Deiphobus felt the warmth on his face, on his hands, warming the bronze of his armor until it became like a second skin. This was what it meant to be alive, not the grand gestures or the moments of high drama, but this quiet attention to the world as it revealed itself moment by moment. A servant girl crossed the courtyard carrying a basket of figs, and he could smell their sweetness even at this distance. Somewhere someone was grinding grain, the sound rhythmic and comforting. A dog barked once, then settled back into silence. These were the sounds of peace, the sounds of a city confident in its own continuance. He had no need to see further than this morning, no need to imagine what tomorrow might bring or what choices it might demand. This moment, the sun on stone, the sound of Troy waking, the simple fact of being alive in this place he loved. This moment was complete in itself. The great gates stood open, showing the city beyond where people were beginning their daily work. Potters at their wheels, weavers at their looms, children learning their letters, old men sharing stories in the shade. All of it continuing as it had for generations, as it would for generations to come, each person playing their part in the great pattern that was Troy's life. Deiphobus placed his helmet carefully on the stone ledge beside him. The bronze caught the light and held it, throwing back bright reflections that danced across the courtyard walls. He would take up his duties again when evening came, would stand watch through another night. But for now he was simply a man in his city, warmed by the sun, surrounded by the sounds and scents of home. The morning was perfect. Troy was perfect. The people he loved were safe, fed, warm, going about their lives with the casual confidence that tomorrow would be much like today. He had no need to see further than this. The sun climbed higher, and the day began. And in that beginning, in that eternal return of light to the world, he found everything he had ever needed to know about what it meant to be alive, to belong somewhere completely, to be part of something larger than himself that would continue long after his own small part in it was finished. In that understanding, he found a peace deeper than sleep, a quiet acceptance that would carry him gently through whatever days remained. Join us for more quiet moments from history, where literary storytelling meets peaceful sleep. Subscribe for stories that honor both the art of narrative and the gift of rest.